In this video, I will be performing 5 movements from a suite in D minor by Jean-Nicolas Geoffroy, namely Allemande, Courante, Sarabande, Gigue, and Chaconne. A short clarification regarding my decision to perform only 5 movements from this suite. As I have mentioned in previous videos, all of Geoffroy's music survives in a single manuscript that was compiled by an unknown scribe after Geoffroy's death. While the scribe has organized most of the dance movements into suites, we cannot be certain that these orderings reflect Geoffroy's own practice or simply the scribe's decision. One reason I find some of the orderings a little questionable is that there are instances where a few too many movements of the same dance type appear together in one suite. For instance, the suite in A minor contains 7 gavottes. On the other hand, it is also important to emphasize that the scribe did not simply lump together into one suite all of the available dance movements in one particular tonality. In some cases, we find more than one suite in the same key. For instance, there are 2 suites in D minor. The 5 movements I am playing come from the first of the 2 suites, which contains a larger number of movements, while the second D minor suite is shorter and is even labeled as a petite suite. My reason for choosing to play only 5 of the movements is that, to me, they form a more coherent and unified work on their own. But of course, this concern for coherence very likely reflects more of a 20th or 21st century rather than a 17th century mindset. I would like now to discuss each of the 5 movements, and while I do want to address aspects of interpretation, I also want to look at some of their features. One particular aspect I would like to emphasize concerns the fact that in Geoffroy's work, movements that belong to the same dance type usually share particular characteristics and particular musical gestures. Something that the literature on Geoffroy tends to emphasize, which I have also discussed at length in previous videos, is the unusual and daring harmonic content of his music, which gives it a distinctive and unique flavor. While this is arguably the one feature that immediately stands out when one first encounters his music, I also think it is fascinating that certain oftentimes highly distinctive musical gestures become associated with a particular dance type and thus reappear with subtle modifications within several movements of the same dance type. In other words, for example, there are specific musical gestures that we find in most Allemandes. And since when it comes to Geoffroy's music, we are oftentimes dealing with a very distinctive and strange harmonic terrain, I find that these common tropes act as familiar signposts that help me navigate this strange musical terrain a little more easily. Let's start with the Allemande. The first aspect of the Allemande I would like to discuss concerns the fairly different ranges of the 2 main sections, something that also affects their individual expressive content and, of course, the overall expressive content of the piece. The first section remains within a predominantly low range since the highest note is this F. The second section, by contrast, generally occupies a markedly higher range, not only because it extends a fourth higher to a B flat, but also because the melody occupies a relatively high range for several measures, and the ascent to the B flat, as well as the descent away from it, is a fairly drawn-out affair. The second aspect of the Allemande concerns a rhythmic gesture it shares with other Allemandes by Geoffroy. This gesture involves the presence of a dramatic pause between the first and second beat of a measure, which is created by the first beat consisting of only one chord, which is either prolonged into the second beat or followed by a rest at the beginning of the second beat. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to start playing at the very beginning, and this dramatic pause that I'm talking about happens at the beginning of measure 5. So I'm going to play up to that point. And I hope you noticed what happened there, where right before I stopped, where we had this kind of idea. So that was that dramatic pause that I was talking about. Now, the same thing, the same gesture, in other words, appears, for instance, in the Allemande of the suite in E minor. And there we get something like this. So there we had it right before I stopped, where we have this. Again, the same type of dramatic pause, and we find this in other Allemandes by Geoffroy as well. Let's turn now to the Courante. What it shares with other Courantes by Geoffroy is the overall texture, which is mostly in two voices throughout. In other words, if I can generalize a bit, the right hand has a single melodic line and basically plays only one note at a time, while the left hand also mostly plays single notes, and when it does play chords, these tend to be two-note chords rather than full triads. It's almost as if the piece were conceived in a linear fashion. Typical of Geoffroy, there are juxtapositions of a regular note and its chromatically altered variant, either side by side or in close proximity to each other. And let me show you what happens at the very first couple of measures. We have something like this. I will play it a little more slowly. So if you notice, what is happening is this. We have a B natural, and then immediately, almost immediately, a B flat. And we find things like that throughout this Courante. Now, when I add ornamentation and embellishments during the repeats, I sometimes try to further emphasize the harmonic clash or spiciness created by these chromatic alterations. So what I could do, for example, in this first measure, I can emphasize it by, say, repeating a couple of times the B natural so that you get it a little more in your head, and then when the B flat comes in the left hand, it sounds a little more clashing. So I could do, instead of what we have on the page, which is this, I could do something like this, for instance. Something to emphasize this kind of clash. Finally, both sections of this Courante have a very simple cadential conclusion, and here I've chosen to embellish the concluding measure of both sections in order to maintain the overall rhythmic drive of the piece. You are going to see what I'm doing when you hear the performance and follow the score. But for instance, what happens at the very end is we just have a simple cadence like this. And I don't remember exactly, but I think I do something like this. Just something to flesh out the cadence, let's say, and simply continue the rhythmic drive of the piece. When it comes to the Sarabande, there are at least two different gestures that we also find in other Sarabandes by Geoffroy. The first one occurs in measures 3 and 4, and I want to compare what happens in these two measures with measures 3 and 4 of the Sarabande in C minor. So first of all, let me play the opening of the D minor Sarabande. And what I really have in mind here, the gesture that I have in mind, is this particular one. And now I'm starting exactly on measure 3, and I'm playing measures 3 and 4. Now, if we look at measures 3 and 4 of the C minor Sarabande, we get something quite similar. And I would say where the similarity is especially obvious is the right hand, where in the D minor version we have this. And in the C minor version, the second gesture concerns a chromatic inflection that takes place within an overall melodic and harmonic descent and occurs at the beginning of the second section. Here are the first 3 measures of the second section of the D minor Sarabande. And here are the first 3 measures of the second section of the C minor Sarabande. And I also played the 4th measure just to conclude the cadence. But especially, I would say, if you notice what's happening in the left hand now, here is the D minor version. And here is the C minor version. So we have this chromatic inflection, and you probably noticed that in both cases the musical lines were descending a little bit. The Sarabande also displays Geoffroy's highly personal and daring harmonic language. So let's look at the second section in a little more detail. Two aspects that, to me at least, stand out involve the use of what I will generally call extended chords and delaying the arrival of the tonic chord of D minor as long as possible, with a combination of both of these factors producing a tonally unstable and perhaps even unsettling soundscape. Now, what I mean by this is that if we were to continue, you recall I started playing the beginning of this second section, and we already had a fairly chromatic passage, and this is kind of only going to intensify with the kinds of chords that we're going to get following those opening measures. So I'm starting again the second section. Now notice these chords here. And what is happening here, again, we can talk of these chords in terms of modern theory. Obviously, composers back then would think of them in a slightly different way, but I think even if we apply modern terms to these, we can still appreciate what is happening. First of all, we have seventh chords, and this one especially is one of the augmented sixth chords. This is a French augmented sixth chord, and he's a French composer, so I guess that's why he's using it. Not really. And the other thing is that all of this time, what I have been playing are chords that are not really any tonic chords at all. We get this one perhaps, but this is not a D minor, this is a D major chord that is actually being used as a dominant. And if I continue, then we start getting extended chords again. Notice we still have not gotten a D minor chord. Here we get one. But that is the end of the piece. So you can see what he's doing is he's prolonging the arrival of the tonic. And of course, this creates a lot of suspense, a lot of tension, and I would say also a lot of expressive tension. Let's turn now to the Gigue. Once again, there are certain elements it shares with other Gigues by Geoffroy, and these include a semi-polyphonic texture, a quirky rhythmic profile, and an overall linear flow of events. What I mean by semi-polyphonic texture is that we have what appears to be an imitative and, more precisely, fugal beginning in three voices, which is closely modeled after the exposition of a fugue, but the rest of the piece treats this opening subject in a very free way. And despite what at first appears to be a three-voice texture, the majority of the piece mostly consists of two active voices. Now, let me show you what I mean by this. We have, at the beginning, we have a subject. So here's our first voice. Here's now our second voice. Now we're going to have a little extension. And here now we're going to have the third voice in the soprano. So we start in what appears to be like a fugue, but then if I were to continue, you would find that again we have basically two voices that are treated very freely, although this opening subject is very much informing the musical narrative of the piece. And for the most part, we really have two independent voices, but not really three. And it is precisely this overall two-voice texture, which in many respects resembles the texture we observed in the Courante, that makes the gigue sound linearly conceived. As for the quirky rhythmic profile, perhaps in this particular gigue the effect is mostly subtle and perhaps more obvious to the performer rather than the listener. But that quirkiness is definitely there, and I want to alert you to it. You will probably appreciate it even more when you listen to the recording and follow the score. But let me show you. Now, again, maybe this is not something that you can really tell just by listening to it, but first of all, we don't start on the first beat. That's not necessarily that unusual. We start on the second half of the third beat of the measure, at least the opening subject. And maybe that's not too strange, but I would say what becomes a little more strange than that is what we have in the second half, the second section of the gigue, where now we're going to start with yet what appears another subject that, of course, is not really going to be treated in a fugal way. This one is going to start on the second beat of the measure. And again, perhaps this is not completely unusual, but Geoffroy is going to use this kind of beginning not exactly on the first beat to introduce certain pauses that are going to sound a little awkward. So I'm going to play from the beginning and up to and a little past the first awkward pause. And I call it awkward because what we have at that point in time is a rest in the first beat of that particular measure. And I hope you noticed it. I tried to kind of signal it with my facial expression. I don't know if it worked. Let me try it one more time. So this kind of quirky rhythm is really going to also inform the rest of the section. The chaconne is in rondo form, which is how the majority of French Baroque chaconnes are structured. What this means is that we have a refrain alternating with contrasting sections. There are a couple of features this chaconne shares with other chaconnes by Geoffroy that we find in the contrasting sections. The first feature is the presence of a chromatically descending bass line at the beginning of a contrasting section. In this case, the first contrasting section. So let me play the beginning of the first contrasting section of the D minor chaconne, and then I will compare that to the beginning of the first contrasting section of the F minor chaconne. So here is the D minor. And here is the F minor. So in the D minor, we have this descending chromatic bass line. And in the F minor, we have this. The second feature involves the presence of a pedal point, or at least a bass line that is mostly static, although the harmonies that are formed above the bass line can be quite intricate. In this particular chaconne, we find this feature in the penultimate contrasting section. Let me play a couple of snippets from that section. So the way it begins is like this, and you will notice that what happens is that we have this D that kind of remains held, in other words, constant, throughout the first couple of measures. And then later in that section, we also have a pedal point that is based on the note E. This one. So we have something like this. Again, so this kind of pedal point, but obviously the harmonies that are being formed above are again quite daring in many respects. Finally, I want to simply mention a couple of additional details, this time involving the refrain of the chaconne. The first one has to do with a chord that we find in the third measure. So if I start the refrain, so this sonority, which perhaps in modern terms you can think of as an augmented chord, this exact same sonority is the very first we hear in a quite well-known Sarabande by Louis Couperin, which starts like this. I just find it interesting that these two sonorities are exactly the same. Obviously, they don't happen in the same spot in each respective piece, but I just think it's a very interesting sonority, especially for the 17th century. The second feature I would like to mention has to do with what happens in the left hand, the bass line, immediately after that chord that I played. And what happens there is that we have a descent that spans 3 octaves. I would say it's quite a radical move, especially for its time. And of course, as we're going towards the bottom of the harpsichord, we get a little more sound out of it. So we also get a sort of dynamic crescendo. I'm going to play this a little more slowly, just so you can really appreciate what is happening. But I think you will appreciate its overall effect when you listen to the piece in context. So here's where I had stopped. And now notice what is happening in the left hand. So we go from here all the way down here. And even when I played it a little more slowly, I hope you could tell how the volume is increasing. We're getting some sort of a dynamic crescendo as we're getting towards the end of that line, and in some respects, the end of that phrase. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the performance.